To the mighty Roman Empire, the land of Britain was nothing more than an ancient legend, a mysterious island hidden beyond the known world. This perception changed dramatically in 55 BC when Julius Caesar set his sights on this fabled territory and sailed toward its shores. What followed was a historical discovery that ended in defeat. Almost a century later, the Romans found glory when Emperor Claudius stepped foot on British soil. They gazed upon Stonehenge, using this sacred site for worship and rituals. Londinium was established and the Romans seized control. But what happened next in the history of the United Kingdom? To understand this fascinating land, we must start from the very beginning. What would become the United Kingdom began during the prehistoric Paleolithic period, dating back 950,000 years ago. This marks the earliest evidence of ancient civilization, tracing back to the first settlers who arrived in Britain. These pioneers were hunter-gatherers who traveled from Europe around 8000 BC and are now known as the First Britons. This group showed one of the earliest forms of economy, with hunters trading native elk, wild cattle, and pigs while defending themselves from wolves and bears that were abundant in Britain. Over the years, archaeologists have discovered numerous tools, including carved stone edges and hand axes. It remains incredibly rare to find human remains from this period, making it difficult for experts to determine which hominids lived there. However, the tools discovered provide evidence they were probably a subgroup of Homo erectus, possibly Homo heidelbergensis. Following the movements of Homo erectus is challenging, with early sites divided by many years and spread across Europe. At one time, Britain was part of the European mainland, making it easy for groups to spread and relocate. As land moved and water levels rose, groups were cut off and left to evolve. These early inhabitants relied on hunting and scavenging, proven by wooden spears discovered in Essex, believed to have been crafted around 450,000 years ago. Stone tools typically survive, so finding wooden remains is incredibly rare and valuable. Hand axes would wear down over years, with flint flakes chipping off. These flakes give archaeologists valuable information about manufacturing techniques, tool complexity, and stone types used. Hand axes weren't used to chop wood, but were more likely for cutting up animal carcasses. Because of their simplicity and the hunter's expertise, they've been discovered in high volumes at ancient sites, proving groups often returned to certain places and chose not to carry tools, instead making new ones upon arrival. As tool-making techniques advanced, Neanderthals began strategizing to hunt larger prey like woolly rhinos and mammoths. The next phase, the Upper Paleolithic era, saw humans physically evolve into what we are today, with only a few elements of our ancestors surviving, like wisdom teeth, once crucial for eating raw food. Europe during this time was incredibly harsh and cold due to the last ice age. This led many inhabitants to leave when temperatures dropped to ensure survival, not only to prevent freezing, but to find vegetation and animal prey year-round. Limestone gorges offered shelter, with deep caves and overhangs being invaluable for camps. Around 11,300 years ago, Britain began warming, initiating substantial growth. Birch and pine trees flourished along with other greenery. Oak, hazel, lime, and elm spread across the land and remain abundant today. Animals like reindeer and horses drew hunters accustomed to tracking them, leading many to travel across Europe and settle in Britain. As climate warmed, inhabitants changed their prey to red deer and boar as other species migrated or died out, forcing humans to evolve their tools and technology. Around 6,300 years ago, during the Mesolithic period, groups began setting up winter and summer camps, allowing them to live in ideal environments, catering to their needs as climate changed through seasons. Sticking to one place would deplete food and resources like wood for fires. Without these, they would perish. Spending time elsewhere meant the habitat could repopulate for when they returned. Coastal sites were chosen for certain times, meaning humans began eating sea-based diets of fish and mollusks. This helped develop tools for catching water-based prey, expanding their knowledge and curiosity about the ocean. The transition from hunting and gathering came around 4100 BC, aided by agricultural techniques from the east. This was propelled by the population boom during the late Mesolithic period, meaning animal resources were depleting fast. The British landscape began changing, with inhabitants making mass flint tools equipped with wooden handles. These were used to clear land so fields, pastures and settlements could be created. Barley and emmer were the first main crops grown, while pigs and cattle were captured and bred to generate meat sources rather than immediate slaughter. This shift to self-sufficient settlements saw the first domestic buildings, including large, narrow wooden buildings called long houses. Another form was structures for the dead called long barrows. The Neolithic period introduced huge changes to Britain in technology, landscape and settlements. The causewayed enclosure became popular, circular monuments with banks and ditches forming rings around settlements. Structures called cursuses were built within circular banks, with the longest discovered in Britain measuring an incredible 10 kilometers. For hunting, arrowhead design evolved, appearing more leaf-shaped to aid aerodynamics. These later changed to chisel and transverse arrowheads to improve their craft, resulting from social changes influenced by different groups mixing and sharing expertise. The chisel arrowhead was easier to use, glued or bound to arrow shafts, making production quicker. During the Middle Neolithic period, British settlers slowed down wild animal hunting depending on livestock. Afterward, arrowheads became less sharpened as they were used as deterrents against other settlements stealing livestock rather than killing thieves. This could have been due to rising social pressures forbidding murder as punishment. Between 2600 and 2200 BC, monuments known as henges were erected, including the famous Stonehenge in Wiltshire, England. While there's no definitive proof, it's believed henges were used for rituals and astronomical observation. Because ditches are inside banks, experts concluded it wasn't for defense, but rather symbolic. During the later Neolithic period, pottery and tools changed. Early Neolithic pottery was round-bottom bowls with sloping necks. By late Neolithic, the style changed to flat-based pots decorated by etches during drying. These pots were primarily used to brew and store beer, though dairy products and stews were also contained in them. With groups gathering and technology advancing, Britain moved into the next critical era. The arrival of metal and beaker-style pots represents the change ushering in the Bronze Age, beginning in 2200 BC. Bronze alloy was actually rarer than iron ore, meaning the resource was reserved for tools while gold was used for jewelry. Another alloy was tin, also scarce in Europe. Because bronze can be cast at lower temperatures than copper, bronze casters could use molds to create elaborate designs like daggers, birds and axes, far more durable than stone tools. Bronze is also harder than copper as the tin reinforces it on an atomic level. Beaker pots were still used after bronze was utilized, with designs, decorations and refinements improving over time. Intact beakers from burials give insight into craftsmanship, sometimes still containing honey residue from beer. Daggers were made longer during the Middle Bronze Age, becoming the first swords made in Britain called rapiers. As social tensions grew, more variations of weapons and shields were made. There's evidence that neighboring settlements used weapons heavily, shown by damage sustained, though they could have been intentionally damaged before being placed in hoards to prevent others from using them. While there's evidence of cremation in the Bronze Age, much of the remains were likely scattered or placed in moving water, evident from the lack of bones found where more bodies should be located. This shows how people mastered fire and ways of increasing heat to burn remains and cast metal. During the Bronze Age, boundaries around land started appearing, traded and claimed by dominant families. Livestock pens and agricultural fields became important, as well as copper mines providing jobs and allowing metalwork to advance swiftly. A historically important site was discovered at Great Orme in Llandudno, Wales, providing 90% of ore used to create axes around northwest Europe. From 1000 BC, another climate change resulted in many Britain areas becoming uninhabitable due to lack of crop growth in cold conditions. Areas once ideal for vegetation became wet and boggy, with the Hekla volcano eruption in Iceland blocking sunlight. With land becoming inhospitable, many settlers moved on while others repurposed fields for livestock. Those refusing to leave built walkways and raised settlements over wetlands, inadvertently improving their building skills. The most preserved examples of cloth, food in pots, tools, furniture, and wooden objects were discovered within bogs below these settlements, as they would have dropped after structures were attacked. Because of lack of oxygen and muddy conditions, these items were preserved for millennia. Near the end of the Bronze Age, long pointed rapier blades evolved into long flat blades with full tangs into cast handles. Weapons were becoming an art form, but remained necessities for survival. Hoards became rarer, believed to result from value dropping. This led to crafters called founders holding back wares to raise value. The first example of market strategy in British history, later becoming incredibly important to economic growth. The Iron Age began around 1200 BC in the Middle East and Southeast Europe, best known for extensive iron and steel crafting. While rare, some settlers dabbled with iron smelting during the late Bronze Age, but it wasn't until the Iron Age that the craft skyrocketed around Europe. The Iron Age was vital to human advancement as it helped speed up civilization growth, provide more resilient settlements, and opened possibilities for crafting tools and weaponry that kept up with other groups around Europe. Because steel is stronger than bronze and lasted longer, it improved tool creation. These tools were also developed for agricultural use, establishing long-lasting settlements. It wasn't just tools and weaponry that evolved. Art, farming techniques, religious beliefs, and alphabetic writings started rising in Britain. The European Iron Age started in the Mediterranean and moved towards Central Europe. By 600 BC, iron crafting skills spread to the northern continent. The early Iron Age was dominated by the Hallstatt chiefs, who were the elite and most powerful. It was within this culture that saw the first fortified hill forts with domesticated animals raised on their land. These would later become castles and palaces, not only for defense, but to boost family wealth. In 450 BC, the Hallstatt culture crumbled and chiefs lost power. This led to other groups rising in Europe, including Minoans, Greeks, Etruscans, Romans, and Celts, who used iron and steel manufacturing for weapons and armor. Out of all these, the Celts became most powerful. The Celts were broken into different tribes spread throughout Britain. Despite sharing a common language, they were named after Keltoi, the Greek word for barbarians. Celtic culture began rising as early as 1200 BC, spreading throughout Britain, Ireland, France, and Spain, though they stayed mostly in Britain and Ireland, with some vocabulary still existing today. While they were around for considerable time, it wasn't until around 700 BC that they were documented by Romans who called them Galli, another word meaning barbarians. Despite their name, Celts were among the most successful people in British history, controlling many parts of the continent, including current-day Ireland. While Celts thrived for centuries, when the Roman Empire grew and spread across Europe, Julius Caesar launched an all-out attack on Celts, slaying thousands and crushing their settlements to claim territories. Caesar's Roman army later tried invading Britain, but failed, allowing Celts to populate the land. But when it comes to Roman involvement in British history, their story was only beginning. As the Roman Empire continued growing, they eventually took control of most of Britain. Before then, the empire had dominated the Mediterranean Sea, successfully storming ancient cities of Carthage and Macedon before taking Egypt and Syria. After travelling through the Alps, they reached Albion, the original name for Britain. By the time Romans arrived, Iron Age settlements had advanced, having thriving agriculture, wooden structures, and large communities. Trading routes had been established between Britain and people of Gaul, who lived in what we know as France and Belgium. Here, wine and first forms of currency were traded. While Julius Caesar failed to take full control, he returned in 55 and 54 BC out of stubbornness and interest in controlling trade. Caesar planned on disrupting Belgian trade routes in the English Channel, believing Britons would help their friends across the sea, making them enemies. Caesar persuaded the Roman Senate to support his invasion, telling them the land was rich in silver, a claim he had no proof for. Before its discovery, Britain was hidden from Romans. Many in the empire thought Albion was a myth, a legend of barbaric groups who practiced disgusting things to Romans. They drank milk from animals. Caesar's plan to invade didn't go well, having to retreat. Undeterred, he returned with 5 legions, allowing him to storm across the Thames River and speak with chieftain Cassivellaunus. This meeting resulted in a peace treaty with Caesar returning to mainland Europe to deal with rebellion and failed harvest. Caesar never returned to Britain. After a civil war, the Republic crumbled under Emperors Augustus and Caligula, who continued growing their empire in Gaul. Their eyes set upon barbarians across the Channel. While interest was there, the time wasn't right. Beyond symbolic throwing of javelins in the ocean, invasion never came. In year 43 AD, Emperor Claudius sailed across with 4 legions, with Aulus Plautius leading, reaching Richborough on the east coast of Kent. The invasion of Britain began. Despite spending only 16 days on the island, the glory-seeking emperor returned to Rome in year 44 and was hailed a hero. Despite the emperor leaving, the empire continued invasion, swiftly taking Catuvellauni territory before spreading north and west. By year 60, much of Wales was under Roman control. Roman kingdoms were created in modern-day Norfolk and other places, with Vespasian sending his legion to the southwest to capture tribal settlements. It was around this time that cities like Londinium, later known as London, was built. While Romans seemed unstoppable, Britons continued resisting. Caraticus, a Celtic tribe member, persuaded groups in Wales to help fight Romans, but was captured. He escaped and fled to the Brigantes, but the Queen handed him back to Romans as a sign of loyalty. Caraticus was sent to Rome with his family as prisoners, and surprisingly was spared death by Claudius. Boudica, Roman ally and wife of Prasutagus, who was client king of the Iceni tribe, headed a revolt after her husband's death. Half his kingdom was to be given to Romans, while Boudica ruled the other half. Rome wasn't happy sharing with someone they classed as a traitor and decided to plunder the whole thing. Boudica retaliated by sending her army to Londinium, where towns were plundered and burned. According to Romans, 70,000 Romans were killed from the revolt, though Boudica and her forces were eventually defeated thanks to Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. Boudica was believed to have ended her life with poison rather than surrender. Romans defeated the Druid stronghold at Anglesey, targeted for their religion, opposed to the empire. This led to the emperor being replaced with Vespasian, who saw great change in how Romans ruled Britain. Eventually, Britons gave in to Roman culture, and previously plundered towns were rebuilt, including London, which became the capital. Taxes were introduced, mining techniques improved, livestock and grain production increased threefold, and the trade industry flourished, including slaves. During this time, roads were established connecting key locations such as London, York, and the Welsh border. This innovation built valuable trade networks and increased the capital's affluence. Romans further implemented their culture, building amphitheatres, Roman baths, and teaching Latin. By year 130, formidable military garrisons were built throughout the continent. Other territories ruled by groups Romans considered barbarians, such as the Balkans, were encouraged to aid Roman expansion. Britain was eventually split in half, called Britannia Superior and Britannia Inferior, to rule more efficiently. The problem was that the more they spread, the more attention they got from enemies. The island saw attacks from Picts of Scotland, Scots of Ireland, and Saxons from Germany. For a period, successful rebellion led to the kingdom separating from Rome, though it was recaptured in year 296. By the end of the 4th century, with Christianity's emergence, Romans slowly lost control of Europe. The lack of food resources like grain spelled the end of the Roman Empire as last emperors withdrew. British cities were given the message that citizens now had to defend for themselves as the empire fell. This is where local governments were created, overthrowing Roman magistrates who had governed for centuries. Despite Britain no longer being part of Rome, their culture continued and shaped the country we see today. In the decades that followed, heretics battled Christians, Saxons from Ireland and Scotland raided English coastal cities, and Europe began falling into the Dark Ages. Britain broke into smaller kingdoms, and a phase of regression began. While Britain saw formidable enemies, their most challenging foe was one they didn't see coming from across the crashing waves of the North Sea. In year 793, a group of Norse people from Scandinavia reached Britain's shores. The first major violent incident was plundering a Christian monastery, ushering in the 300-year age of the Vikings. As more longboats arrived, barbaric invaders began raiding coastal settlements around England, Scotland, and Ireland. Eventually, the son of legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, decided it was time to take up roots on the island instead of simply pillaging. This group would become known as the Great Heathen Army. In year 865, the army arrived at one of 4 British kingdoms, East Anglia. Fearful of the warriors, King Edmund the Martyr offered the invaders provisions, horses, and shelter to be spared violence and takeover. Following defeat, Edmund was captured, possibly tortured, and killed. It took only a couple of years for Vikings to capture York, capital of Northumbria. By year 870, all kingdoms had been successfully taken except Wessex. At this point, Danish warlord Guthrum the Old was leading the Norse army, while Alfred the Great remained king of Wessex. The two forces met in a bloody battle in 878 called the Battle of Edington, where Alfred the Great claimed victory. This led to the Treaty of Wedmore. In a strange turn, one requirement was to have Guthrum baptized with King Alfred becoming his godfather. Vikings were also ordered to leave Wessex and never return. Soon after, the rulers made another deal defining boundaries and opening trade routes. Over many years, Viking customs had taken full effect in territories they owned, including London. This land became known as Danelaw, with Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford becoming the most important towns under their control. These 5 boroughs were ruled by 5 Danish armies, all under control of a Jarl, a Viking elite. For almost a century, Vikings and Anglo-Saxons lived in harmony, trading, working, and even mating. Many words we use today came from old Viking language, such as words beginning with SK, like sky. Other words derived from Old Norse include ugly, from ugliga, husband, from husbondai, gift, from gipt, egg, from egg, and Thursday, from Thor's dagger or Thor's day. It was the Vikings' strong belief in a law system that developed not only the word law in English, but also the word wrong, expressing their belief in differentiating from what was unacceptable. While Alfred the Great used peace to build forts and defences, his daughter Ethelflaed used strongholds to wage war against Vikings after her husband died in year 911. She took control over Mercia, giving her the name Lady of the Mercians. Thereafter, the 5 boroughs under Viking rule were eventually defeated, and in 954, the last Nord king, legendary Eric Bloodaxe, was forced out of Northumbria. This ended the era of Danelaw, now known as England. Although Viking reign was squashed, those who retreated weren't finished with the land they called home. In year 1013, Swine Forkbeard and his Viking warriors returned, with the leader becoming the first Danish king of England. After the king's death, his son Nut the Great took over until he passed in 1035. The rule of Vikings ended when King Harold successfully thwarted King Harald Hardrada of Norway in 1066 in the Battle of Stamford Bridge. This time, Viking invaders had been expelled from England forever, though their legacy lives on in the DNA of descendants. The Middle Ages and Viking Age overlap, with this period starting around year 400 and lasting over 1,000 years, ending in 1485. This period is broken into 3 sections: early, high, and late Middle Ages. We've already covered the early Middle Ages with Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. After the defeat of both groups in 1066, including Nord ruler King Harald Hardrada and Edward the Confessor, who saw defeat by Normans during the Battle of Hastings, while the Anglo-Saxon time came to an end, during their time they made great strides and advancements. Families began building single houses for all generations to live in, from youngest child to grandparents. These homes were made from wood with thatched roofs to keep them dry and warm. All houses were built close together, with a grand hall being the focal point of their community. The heart of the home was known as the hearth, a fire used to cook food, provide light, and keep the family warm. It wasn't just homes that Anglo-Saxons improved, but the agriculture of the land. In fact, the main form of work during this period was farming. This involved cultivating crops, breeding and raising animals, trading, chopping trees to create more farmland, and constructing buildings. Even children were put to work, herding cows and sheep with help from dogs they trained. There were also incredibly skilled professions within Anglo-Saxon communities, including blacksmiths who made weapons to tools, carpenters who built furniture, carts and bowls, cobblers who used leather to make shoes, and jewelers who used precious metals to craft beautiful items traded with the wealthy. It was Anglo-Saxons who invented the plough, completely changing how farming was done. They also discovered that when tamed, a horse could do a much better job pulling ploughs through soil than oxen, speeding up the farming process exponentially. Regardless, their time had to come to an end with the Anglo-Normans taking root. The Normandy dynasty began with William the Conqueror, also known as William the Bastard, who ruled England until his death on September 9, 1087. The invasion of England was no easy feat, with even the mighty Roman Empire struggling to take over completely. This heralded William as a hero, bringing him much attention throughout Europe. It was during his reign that the landscape changed dramatically. The first stone-built Norman castle was built in Wales, with others joining throughout the island. Normans invaded much of Wales and built castles to establish strongholds against anyone opposing them. The Normans brought beautiful stone architecture to England, including the breathtaking Canterbury Cathedral, finished in 1077, the Tower of London, finished in 1078, Oxford University, founded in 1096, and the commission of the Domesday Book, which recorded land valuation throughout England and parts of Wales. While William was considered a great ruler by Normans, the feudal system implemented meant that Anglo-Saxon landowners and farmers were now peasant farmers working for whatever governing power was above them. They were stripped of their heritage, hard work, and wealth. The feudal system saw a quarter of previous owners' land given to William the Conqueror, while another quarter was donated to the Church of Rome. The remains of land were given to people loyal to William who held high status. In return, these people were tasked with creating an army from those living in the area if William ever needed it. For these noble folk, the job was beneath them, leading to them putting knights in charge of recruitment and training. The peasant farmers the crown stole from were not spared this duty, forced to swear allegiance to knights. With advance in agriculture came more variety in food they grew and ate. Normans grew a liking for spiced food, often cooking with caraway seeds, ginger, cardamom, pepper, and nutmeg. Because Normans celebrated Christmas, these ingredients were added to traditional winter meals. The affluent had grand feasts that included pheasants, peacocks, wild boar, jellies, and custards. Common foods eaten by peasants were salted or pickled foods such as pickled herrings, bacon, and vegetable broths because they took longer to expire. While noble members washed feasts down with wine, peasants drank strong ales. The high and late periods of Middle Ages spanning 11th to 13th centuries saw great change negatively impacting the country. The feudal system encouraged huge social changes in class systems, while rebellions saw mass upheaval. The introduction of Renaissance saw introduced artistic expression and storytelling that would eventually give famous playwrights like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe tools to tell common people political or romantic stories often inspired by real-life events. This period has been romanticized by literature and modern media, portraying the period as one with blushing maidens, eye-watering feasts, majestic castles watching over the land, and knights bravely galloping into battle mounted on steeds. In truth, it was a difficult and dangerous life for most of the populace. Eventually, after several sons of William the Conqueror spent time on the throne, William the Conqueror's grandson Stephen of Blois became king in year 1135. This started a huge civil war in Britain known as the Anarchy, lasting from 1138 to 1154. This conflict was led by Stephen of Blois' cousin, Empress Matilda, who believed the crown was her rightful inheritance. This time was incredibly difficult for everyone living in Britain, from wealthy nobles to lowly peasants. People began getting suspicious and desperate, leading to oppression and mistreatment. Many innocent people were tortured and interrogated for information, while others stole goods and gold to make money for families. Most were left with nothing, leading to families starving to death. The civil war ended when Stephen of Blois died in 1154, when Empress Matilda's son Henry II took the throne. The rule of Henry II was fairly peaceful, bolstered by his friendship with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Together, the two men had power over people of England and their religion. Unfortunately, the friendship wasn't long-lived, with Henry ordering the murder of Thomas Becket inside Canterbury Cathedral. The freedom of a man was complicated during the 12th century. Some men were connected to land ownership but forced to pay the lord. Others only paid rent but owed no land, while some found themselves in the middle, owing service to a master while paying rent for land. If someone couldn't pay taxes, they'd answer to a master overlooking the area. While non-free people known as serfs could be freed, another way of escaping control was to escape to another borough and live there for a whole year. If the fugitive was caught before then, the lord of the manor had the right to beat and imprison the man. King John, who came to throne in 1199, was one of the cruelest rulers. He struck fear in hearts of his subjects, increasing taxes so he could hire mercenaries to keep everyone in check. No one was spared King John's wrath, with even the Pope finding himself on the wrong end of the king. In year 1208, John refused to accept Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury after Pope Innocent III decided to ignore the king's candidates. Regardless, church bells of Britain were not rung and the church stopped burying people, but King John still refused to allow Stephen Langton to take up the role. This resulted in the Pope excommunicating King John, which absolved all English subjects of their oath of allegiance to him, causing him to lose all power. This blow resulted in revolt breaking out and the King of France using chaos to challenge rulership of England. With upheaval, King John was forced to sign a very important charter called the Magna Carta, agreeing that the country would abide by many laws and justices, 4 of which are still present today. With no other choice and the French invasion in full swing, King John eventually accepted Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury. This decision led to forces abiding the king again, allowing them to defeat French armies on the coast of Flanders in Belgium. In 1265, King Henry III was incredibly against citizens having any say in the kingdom's rulership. The Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort, thought differently and opposed the king. While Magna Carta laid groundwork for prominent laws, de Montfort created the first Parliament of England, electing people to speak on behalf of the average person. Just like today, representatives of Parliament had expenses paid. In 1298, taxation control was given to Parliament, bolstering the institution. One of the most devastating pandemics in British history was the Black Plague, which devastated the population in 1347. Over 20 million people died from the viral disease throughout Europe, with 1.5 million coming from Britain. The initial English plague lasted 3 years, ending in 1350, with disease popping back up multiple times in the 50 years following. For many years, it was believed plague was passed by rats, but it's now believed to be airborne disease that would kill infected in just days. Peasants were affected worst, as so many poor people lived in close contact. Due to unprecedented volume dying, rotting corpses were left piled in streets, with primitive science offering no cure. With peasant workers dropping from disease, it became difficult to find people to tend fields and grow crops. This led to starvation and decimation of entire villages. As they were desperately in demand, many peasant workers took advantage, moving around to find higher paid positions. The government didn't like that peasants were able to better themselves and chose to side with those willing to pay more. After trying to put a stop to them travelling, the government tried to stop it. This resulted in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in which poor folk violently banded together to get poll tax and wage cap removed, as well as abolishment of control lords had over them and property. Another huge event was the War of the Roses, which saw House of Lancaster and House of York fight each other between 1455 and 1485. The reason was that both sides were descendants of previous King Edward III and wanted to take their rightful place on the throne. The last significant battle, the Battle of Bosworth Field, saw one of the most famous kings, Richard III, fall in battle. After this, Henry VII took the throne, who married Elizabeth of York and joined the two opposing houses together. With the birth of the infamous Henry VIII, the Tudor period was ushered in. The Tudor period had huge focus on reshaping and rethinking religion, politics and monarchy in Britain. After defeating Richard III's army during Battle of Bosworth in 1485, Henry VII's rule saw the beginning of a 118-year reign for the Tudors, which saw 5 monarchs sit upon the throne. The rulers of this period have become some of the most recognizable in English history. It was this rulership that played a huge part in shaping England and later the United Kingdom through economic changes, changed roles for women, and countrywide religious reform. The marriage between the two cousins brought the feud between Lancasters and Yorks together, bringing 2 of the most influential families together. Henry and Elizabeth went on to have 8 children to cement longevity of family rule, although only Arthur, Henry, Margaret and Mary Tudor made it to adult years. Arthur went on to marry Princess Catherine of Aragon, but soon died after. Princess Margaret married James IV, earning her the title of Queen Consort of Scotland. Princess Mary married French King Louis XII, Henry VII became King of England as Henry VIII. As Henry was the second son of monarchy, he was prepared for career in the church, but after his two brothers died, he was made king in 1509. In fact, he lost two brothers and father in a 7-year period, testament to short lifespan people had back then, regardless of status. Henry was keen to find a wife and turned to his own brother's widow, Princess Catherine of Aragon, to take up this role. Henry's 36-year rule saw many impactful changes and caused some of the biggest controversies in English history up until that point. The first was his change in attitude towards his wife, who failed to give him a male heir to throne. After 23 years of marriage, he became so desperate for a male heir that he eventually turned his back on Catholic Church and began his own, the Church of England. With the king now able to establish his own marriage and annulment rules, Henry allowed himself to remarry so he could have a son to ensure his legacy remained on throne. This freedom allowed Henry to have 6 marriages in total, which allowed him to have many children. While only one would be a boy, his son Edward VI was crowned king in 1547 after Henry passed away of tuberculosis. In a twist of irony, after all effort his father put into ensuring bloodline continues, Edward died just a few years later in 1553, leaving no male heirs. This death left Tudor government in chaos, with only his 2 sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, being the only candidates for succession. This was non-ideal, as they were both female and had religious views not in line with Protestants. It was Edward's devout Catholic half-sister Mary that was rightful heir to throne. Due to her religion, however, Edward named Lady Jane Grey as queen, who was his cousin once removed because she was Protestant. Mary, however, wasn't going to let her birthright go. This resulted in Lady Jane only reigning for 9 days before being executed for high treason, along with her husband, 2 of his brothers, and former Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer. Now, with Mary on throne, Tudors were once again thrown into chaos as she set about reversing all work her father and brother did, reverting primary religion of England back to Catholicism. This change was done aggressively, with Protestant people now persecuted for being heretics. This led to 300 people who refused to be conformed being burned at stake. This dark patch in English history is now known as Marian persecution. Not only were Queen Mary's forceful religious views a problem for nobility, but so was her gender being the first queen earned in her own right. Several of most influential nobles insisted she should marry a Protestant man to heal relationship with her people. Mary, who wouldn't be pushed around, chose to marry Spanish Prince Philip II in 1554 instead. Unfortunately, the pair didn't have any children despite many attempts. Eventually, Mary named her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth the next heir as she lay dying. Elizabeth I's long reign, spanning from 1558 to 1603, steadied the ship of state after the tumultuous rules of her siblings. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn, whose marriage had ruptured England from Rome, Elizabeth had to work tirelessly to secure her position and persuade her people to support her. Through her formidable intelligence, political cunning, and charismatic persona, she secured a glorious reign that would define an era. That is not to say her rule was without peril. She faced Catholic plots aiming to assassinate her and place her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne, a direct attack from the Spanish Armada sent by her former brother-in-law, Philip II of Spain, and constant pressure to marry and produce an heir. Her decision to never marry earned her the titles of the Virgin Queen Gloriana and Good Queen Bess, and she famously declared herself married to her kingdom. When she passed away in 1603, the Tudor period came to an end, and the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, ushering in the Stuart dynasty. Life under the Tudors saw agriculture remain the backbone of the economy, with a staggering 90% of the population working the land, an incredibly hard life with a low life expectancy. However, as the age of exploration dawned, the nation's focus began to shift towards global trade. Coal, tin, iron, and lead mining grew exponentially, generating immense wealth for the country. Despite this newfound affluence in some sectors, famine and poverty remained rife throughout Tudor England. In 1530, the cruel laws against beggars were abolished, and vagrants were permitted to beg, provided they had a license. This led to an influx of people seeking charity, which in turn resulted in a new law in 1547 stating that anyone caught begging would be imprisoned for 2 years. By 1550, the punishment was changed again to a public flogging. It was under Elizabeth I that the Poor Law of 1601 was introduced, offering the destitute tax relief and other forms of support, establishing a framework for state-sponsored welfare. The criminal justice system during this era preferred physical punishments over imprisonment. These included flogging and being placed in the stocks, which added a layer of public humiliation to the pain. More serious crimes, such as murder, still merited execution. Noble and affluent criminals continued to be beheaded, a supposedly cleaner and more dignified death, while the common populace were hanged at the gallows, often before a crowd gathered for the morbid spectacle. Education became a greater focus during the Tudor period. The educationalist Richard Mulcaster insisted that a boy's education was paramount, as they were deemed more worthy. This led to boys from wealthy families being sent to grammar schools and universities, while girls, despite the example of powerful female monarchs, were largely predestined for lives as wives and mothers, versed in needlework, cooking, and cleaning. Eventually, girls were granted the right to a basic education, though it was typically limited to reading and writing. Local schools were gradually established where boys and girls could study together, laying the groundwork for universal education. It was also during the Tudors that leisurely activities began to flourish. People took to playing tennis and a rough early form of football, as well as watching jousting events and gambling. The more affluent members of society played chess and gambled, using card games such as Primero and Noddy, a precursor to cribbage. After Elizabeth's death in 1603, James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns of the two nations. As the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, executed for treason, James had become a martyr for the Catholic cause. While many English Catholics hoped he would support their religion, he refused to repeat the mistakes of Queen Mary by trying to roll back the Reformation. When English Catholics did not get the support they desired, a group of conspirators, including the infamous Guy Fawkes, plotted to blow up the Houses of Parliament on a day when the King would be present. In 1605, the plan was foiled, and the conspirators were hanged, drawn, and quartered. This event is commemorated every year on November 5th as Bonfire Night. Despite this attempt on his life, James's reign brought a measure of peace, joining England and Scotland together, though they remained separate kingdoms. When James died, his son Charles I took the throne in 1625. Charles was a devoted Anglican who loved the arts, but he was also a firm believer in the divine right of kings, leading him to rule for 11 years without Parliament. He was eventually forced to recall Parliament to raise money, but he refused to grant them any meaningful power or control over the land and the church. This intransigence led to the outbreak of the English Civil War in August 1642. This devastating conflict, which raged for 9 years, saw the number of people killed, both in combat and from war-related diseases, estimated to be in the millions, a staggering proportion of the population at the time. The civil wars forced castles back into military service, some for the first time since the Middle Ages. Many were besieged by opposing factions to gain strategic strongholds. In 1647, King Charles was defeated by the Parliament's new model army, led by Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. Charles was held prisoner at Carisbrooke Castle, where peace negotiations were meant to take place. Unbeknownst to Fairfax and Cromwell, however, Charles was secretly planning a second civil war, which broke out a year after he was imprisoned. This led to the king being executed for treason in 1649. The news that a king had been beheaded by his own people shocked Britain and Europe to its core. This led to the future Charles II trying to invade the country with the help of the Scots. This attempt failed, with Charles only avoiding death by famously hiding inside an oak tree at Boscobel House in Shropshire. Government and church powers weakened after the beheading, which saw the rise of new and radical ideas, often spread through pamphlets. Growing religious sects began to preach about the second coming of Christ, a belief that spread throughout the country at this time. Oliver Cromwell ruled the Commonwealth of England, Scotland and Ireland, donning the title of Lord Protector. Although Cromwell had his own radical religious views, he allowed all religions to be practiced throughout the country. Cromwell used his army to keep control of the country right up until his death. When his forces weakened, Charles II was free to return in 1660 to rule the country in what became known as the Restoration. The reign of Charles II, which spanned 25 years, saw changes to art, architecture, daily life and leisure. In fact, it was this period that saw the revival of theatres, which had been closed under the Puritan rule of Cromwell. This period also brought some incredible scientific discoveries, such as the manufacture of phosphorus, which was dipped into wooden splints to create matches. The Royal Society was founded, promoting scientific exploration and discovery. With that being said, there were several disasters that happened during this time, including the Great Plague of 1665, which killed an estimated 100,000 Londoners, and the Great Fire of London that broke out in 1666. The fire, which started in a small bakery on Pudding Lane, raged for 4 days and destroyed a vast portion of the medieval city. Ironically, the fire helped to purge the plague, and the rebuilding effort, led by architects like Christopher Wren, created a new, more modern London of brick and stone. The Catholic brother of the king, James, went under heavy criticism about whether he should be the next king due to his religion. Regardless, he succeeded his brother, becoming King James II. While the king defended the throne against the Duke of Monmouth, his illegitimate Protestant brother, he became disliked by many for the violent trials of the rebels and the pro-Catholic policies he put forward. Eventually, William of Orange, the husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, invaded England in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which led to James fleeing and the pair being crowned king and queen. The rule of William III and Mary II marked a peaceful period for the country. Mary's sister Anne took the throne afterward in 1702. While her reign was known for victories in the War of Spanish Succession against Louis XIV of France, the most monumental event was the Act of Union in 1707, which saw the beginning of a united Great Britain, merging the parliaments of England and Scotland. Now we've spoken a lot about the monarchy and rule, as it was the rich and powerful who could learn to read and write to document their lives and historical achievements. But what were the lives of everyday Britons like in the 18th century, known as the Georgian era? Most of the common people during this era were poor, with some forced to live in terrible conditions. This was only made worse by an influx in population, which saw entire areas impoverished and starving. This led to poor laws being implemented, which were first introduced a century before by Elizabeth I, which helped the poorest people of the country. Most of those working had a master above them who would provide them with a room and wages to live on. Vagrancy became a huge issue during this period, as the most impoverished people were forced to beg or claim charity from family and neighbours. In fact, many poor people chose to travel to the New World in order to change their lives and make money. While times were most difficult at the start of the Stuart period, things got better near the end of it for the poor. The focus was on finding the next meal. When food stocks were down, people concentrated on the harvest industry. When soldiers during the Civil War were waiting for payment, many of them resorted to stealing crops and livestock, which heavily affected the industry and led to more starvation. While the working class ate legume-based diets such as beans and lentils, the affluent ate rich meat diets and very sweet desserts. This led to many illnesses as a result, including diabetes and hemorrhoids. While there was a lot of poverty in England, many people held jobs to provide for their families. Merchants and store owners flourished during the Georgian era, which gave them the money to leave London when the plague broke out. Many people were employed as shoemakers, blacksmiths, tailors, saddle crafters and glovers, just to name a few. On the streets of towns and cities, many people sold a variety of wares from oysters to furniture, as well as offering services that ranged from shoe shining to prostitution. Those working on farms would be in charge of milking cows, collecting eggs, tilling the fields, and taking care of the livestock. During this period, like those that came before it, roles were defined by the sexes, with girls expected to follow the orders of their father, brothers, husbands, and then their sons. The wife and mother of the family were put in charge of running and cleaning the house, preparing food, and raising the children. If a woman came from a wealthy family, she could avoid marriage and the duties that came with it, while poorer women chose to work as servants, wet nurses, or midwives. The sad truth is that many women only found freedom after being made a widow. Some could argue that when it came to relationships, aristocratic families had it more difficult than common people. The reason for this was because the influential and wealthy were forced to marry due to political or financial reasons rather than genuine love. Marriage was so important during this period that an act was passed in 1604 that stated that a man who left his family or committed bigamy would be deemed a rogue, which would merit a punishment. In the later part of the Stuart era, a document called the Political Arithmetic was published, which talked about all of the people working in England, including those working in agriculture and manufacturing. In it, William Petty, the writer, expressed his concern about how gold and silver were now in scarcity and that the country was growing poorer by the day. He also claimed that the focus on Ireland, Scotland, and America was a burden to the country and provided no advantage. While this opinion may sound harsh, many shared the opinion that England had overstretched its assets, which now meant the population was suffering as a result. By the early 18th century, Scotland and England were unified, and in 1707, Queen Anne officially passed the Acts of Union. Sadly, life expectancy was much shorter than that of today, with the likelihood of children dying being incredibly high. In fact, childbirth was dangerous for both the mother and the child. Without the medicines and treatments we have today, if the trauma and pain didn't kill the mother, infections would soon after. Experts believe that 25 women out of 1,000 died giving birth during this period. Other things that killed young people during this era were worms, plague and dysentery, as well as an illness known as griping in the guts, which killed people through diarrhea and crippling stomach pain. A major factor in these kinds of illnesses came down to personal hygiene, which was not held in high regard. This also led to parasites like fleas and lice infesting every level of social class. Intestinal worms were also common, with eggs being laid or passed into foods when being prepared. In their spare time, people living in this period would enjoy dancing, singing, and listening to live music at music halls and other venues. While higher classes went to the theatre, common folk would enjoy betting on cockfighting and dogfighting. Another blood sport that brought many people together were public executions, which would be held in town squares. During the Georgian era, food and drinks from other countries began to become popular in England. The reason for this was down to the global trade routes established via road and ocean, which also introduced wares never seen before on British soil. This included furs from North America, tea from China, and spices from India. This is where the palate of the British people changed, with exotic wares and ingredients being welcomed into the culture. By 1633, strange yellow fruit known as bananas were found on market stalls, while the first coffee houses and tea rooms opened their doors. It was here that many people would visit to discuss politics and other business. During its early days, coffee was considered to be a man's drink, which led to women being banned from visiting the coffee houses. Women looking for a warm drink could visit tea rooms, however, while hot chocolate was available to higher-class members of both sexes. The 18th century bled into a period of exponential growth that carried on through the Victorian era. At this point, industries of rural and agriculture were dwarfed by factories and urbanization. This sudden change was a culture shock to many communities, and it took a while for the government and the people of Britain to get used to this new way of life. The Victorian era started in 1837 and ended around the outbreak of the First World War. Despite Queen Victoria passing away in 1901, it was during this era that Britain saw another boom in the population, with figures doubling between 1801 and 1871. This was down to people being able to afford the upkeep of larger families as a result of the work opportunities the Industrial Revolution provided. Migration in the country increased the population, although many left the country as well. In fact, a large number voluntarily left for the American colonies in search of a better life in the New World. Large groups of Irish workers made up a majority of the migrants, especially in 1845 during the Irish potato famine that caused starvation in many parts of the country. People from Ireland, Scotland, and the English countryside flocked to industrial cities for work, as well as Jews from Europe and Russia. While conditions for working children were awful, legislation for protecting child and adult workers was passed by Parliament, campaigned for by reformers like Michael Sadler and the Earl of Shaftesbury. This forced safer procedures to be implemented within mines and factories, and also put an end to slavery within the British Empire in 1833. Education for children younger than 10 was also made compulsory, which nurtured the prospect of common people taking up more skilled jobs. The police force, which had evolved a lot since the 19th century, was more organized and efficient. They also began a prison reform program that saw conditions within prisons greatly improve. While there still were clear social class divides, social freedom and the ability to keep more of their money had improved many lives. Entrepreneurs taking advantage of the opportunities within the Victorian era used their wealth to rise in society, building huge houses and employing domestic servants to take care of the household. In fact, in the 1880s, 1.25 million people in Britain were working as domestics, which was more than any other industry. This was the first time that the hierarchy wasn't governed solely by royalty or lordship, which ushered in a new era of social change. The working class was eventually allowed to vote in 1918, with the suffrage of women ending in 1928. In 1776, Britain lost the American Empire after America declared independence during the American Revolutionary War, which resulted in the empire turning its sights to India instead. Throughout the Victorian era, the expansion into other countries continued, which opened up more trade routes and prompted more conflicts. In 1851, the Great Exhibition presented industrial and technological wonders to the world. At this point, the British Empire was the leader of trading and military strength, making it a force to be reckoned with. In fact, the British Empire held so many territories that the sun never set upon the empire, referencing how far their control reached. It was during the Victorian period that leisure really boomed, with religious holidays, seaside vacations, museums, theatres, sports, and music halls hitting peak popularity. With better education and opportunities, middle-class members of society could now become skilled labourers. For the poor, however, circumstances were just as bad as those seen centuries before. The houses of the middle class evolved during this period, with iron cooking ranges appearing in most homes. These ovens not only cooked food more efficiently than before, but also heated tanks that provided hot water. Gas-powered geysers also sent hot water from the tanks to the bathroom, which eliminated the need for a maid to carry buckets of heated water up the stairs. The coffee shops that were once a hub for the affluent and politically minded had been replaced with offices that communicated with others through the revolutionary telegraph system. This allowed Britain to trade with the entire world, which was only improved further in 1876 with the invention of the telephone. The English scientist and inventor William Henry Fox Talbot invented the first photographs in the 1830s, which became wildly popular and were sold as carte de visite, very small photographs that were often given to people as visiting cards. Among the most popular subjects distributed was Queen Victoria and her children, which was the first time most people had seen their queen outside of officially painted portraits. At the Great Exhibition, George Jennings presented his state-of-the-art lavatories, which he called halting stations. This invention proved to be more sanitary than people relieving themselves in secluded corners of the street, which led to public lavatories being erected in 1852. A men's room was built in Fleet Street, with a woman's lavatory being built in the Strand. It was Thomas Crapper who later developed the flush aspect of the lavatory and also invented the U-bend. Many believe that the word for bodily waste came from Thomas Crapper's name, although the word crap actually came from the Dutch word krappen, which means to separate, and the Old French word crapper, which means waste or rejected matter. Because cotton needs to be produced in a humid environment, many manufacturers established their factories in Manchester because of the volume of rain the city gets. Unfortunately, the factories were still full of dust and cotton fibers in the air, which resulted in many workers suffering from breathing illnesses. The large machines in these factories also posed a risk, with many of them not having any form of safety protocols or guards. This led to several cases of women being scalped after their hair got caught, as well as hands, fingers, and arms being caught and crushed in the moving parts. Children were often sent into or beneath the machines to clear blockages or replace intricate parts, which also ended in terrible accidents. Elsewhere in the country, the gentry owning large portions of land were becoming incredibly rich from coal mining, with the industries utilizing steam power keeping the demand high. While mining kept the country thriving, the conditions deep down in the earth were terrible. Children were hired to drag the wagons from the coalface to the shaft, which would then be lifted to the surface, because they were much cheaper and more obedient than horse-drawn carts. This was incredibly hard work and ran the risk of being caught in a collapse. Mines got incredibly hot, which meant that workers wore very little clothing and had to drink beer to keep hydrated. The reason they drank alcohol was down to the poor quality of water, which caused diarrhea, dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, which would prove deadly to its drinkers. In 1815, Sir Humphrey Davy invented the safety lamp, which allowed deeper excavations into the earth. Later, ventilation techniques were implemented, although it wasn't until 1848 that compressed air systems were invented. Employing children under the age of 12 was banned in 1860, although the number of employees grew from 200,000 to 500,000 in Britain. This allowed 30 million tons of coal to be excavated in 1836, which rose to an incredible 44 million tons by 1880. By 1850, a person could only work for 10 hours a day, with night work abolished. This meant that the average working day lasted from 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Also in 1850, lighting and ventilation regulations came into effect for mining, further improving the well-being of the workers. With that being said, mining was still an incredibly dangerous job, which wouldn't have been properly improved until the 1900s. It had become common practice to pay workers with tokens that could only be used at selected shops instead of paying them money. This led to shops inflating prices and providing poor quality items, as workers had no other choice. The Truck Act established in 1831 set to end this practice, but it took a long time for it to end completely. The British Empire proved itself to be the most innovative and captive market in the entire world due to its industrial breakthroughs. Unfortunately, it was this achievement that became its own downfall when it came to keeping all of its territories, as the prosperity inspired parts of the empire to become separate entities to seek their own success. At the time, the United States was growing at an incredible rate, forging its own legacy in technology and innovation. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in 1914, Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia, which led to the July Crisis, and eventually, on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, drawing in a web of alliances. Britain offered up its services in what is now known as the First World War. This explosive period ushered in the modern age, where the focus shifted from the monarchy and industrial revolution to the development of weaponry and strategic warfare that took the lives of millions due to trench warfare. The country saw unprecedented levels of death. By the time the fighting came to an end, over 16 million lives, both soldiers and civilians, were lost. At this point, Britain was dependent on its industry and agriculture sectors. Industry shifted their production to supplying munitions for the war effort, with many factories being commandeered by the government. Agriculture supplied food to the country as stocks being imported became limited due to the threat of enemy U-boats. While young men were enlisted in the army, women had to go to work in factories making bullets and uniforms, as well as working on farms. Women also worked in nursing and caring roles as the casualties took their toll on resources. While it was those on the front line that fought for victory, it would not have been possible without the efforts of those back home in Britain. At the start of the war, miners were told not to join the army as they were needed to provide coal for the war effort. As the conflict raged on, however, miners were drafted as tunnellers, who were tasked with the dangerous job of digging tunnels to set explosives beneath enemy trenches, as well as placing landmines on the battlefield. The Germans were far more prepared for this kind of warfare, which gave them a massive advantage initially. While there was a focus on drafting experienced miners, there were not enough to fill the quota, which led to civilians being trained as miners and sent to war. Eventually, the British became more skilled at tunnelling than the Germans. With many miners enlisted in the army, there was a shortage of coal. In October 1916, this led to the supply being rationed per household. Those who refused to enlist in the army were forced to become miners instead to help maximise the coal supply. Many people working in agriculture were enlisted in the army, which greatly affected the industry. Because U-boats were blocking imports coming into the country, farm work was crucial. This work was only made more difficult as blacksmiths and ploughmen were taken from farms to fight, making it incredibly difficult to replace them. In order to replace the male farm workers, the Women's Land Army was established, which sent 260,000 women to farms to help agriculture work continue. While the war ended on November 11, 1918, sadly this wasn't the last time Britain saw war and mass death, with World War II breaking out in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. Between 1945 and 1951, Britain was healing from the effects of World War II, with the Labour Party leading the charge after replacing Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, who was hailed a hero for the part he played in the war. The Labour Party had been established in 1900 to oppose the Conservative Party, which had been the country's oldest political party. The Labour Party won the election in 1945 by a landslide and was favoured as people believed that the pre-war government didn't understand the needs of ordinary people. Despite Churchill's impressive leadership during the war, many believed that he wouldn't be a good leader during a time of peace. During this period, the Labour Party established national insurance in 1946, as well as the NHS, the National Health Service, which has been providing free healthcare for the British nation since 1948. Industrial sectors such as mining, banking, gas, and aviation were nationalised, which allowed working environments to be made much safer for workers. Eventually, the economy recovered and industries returned to the efficiency and profitability they had experienced before. Shortly after World War II, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union began. In order to bolster the forces of their allies, the Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin offered Britain's support to the United States. Britain also participated in the Korean War in 1950, on the side of South Korea alongside America. Britain later became an original member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949. This treaty was established with the United States and other European nations in order to protect them from the Soviet Union, which was developing nuclear warfare. In 1947, India successfully achieved independence, taking the jewel in the crown of the British Empire away. This was the start of the British Empire's dismantlement after centuries of taking territories for their own. Between 1950 and 2000, Britain changed in many ways. Immigration increased, class division lessened, and the welfare state was established. With the loss of many colonies and territories, Britain joined a union with Europe. The manufacturing industries that made the country thrive shifted to providing services and relying on imports rather than producing them within the country. Although Britain saw inflation and recessions, the standard of living was at an all-time high. On February 6, 1952, Queen Elizabeth II was named the Queen of England, following the death of her father, King George VI. King George had had one of his lungs removed after it became cancerous from years of smoking. Although he did recover from the surgery, he suddenly passed away in his sleep from a coronary thrombosis. Although Britain was in peacetime after 1945, the threat of the Cold War led to the country spending heavily on defense, military supplies, and training. The threat of nuclear attack was terrifying, which led to funds being channeled into developing defenses. The leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, which was a huge blow to Britain's trade economy. In response, Britain, France, and Israel decided to invade Egypt in order to regain control of the Suez Canal. This was met with a lot of criticism from the United States and other countries, including the Soviet Union. This opposition led to the United Kingdom withdrawing from the invasion, as the United States and the United Nations put a lot of pressure on them. This resulted in the value of the pound dropping as international investors withdrew their interest and assets. This led to a financial crisis that proved that Britain needed to rely on allies when it came to military strategy. Following the two world wars, the 1960s brought a new age of liberation and expression, with the culture shifting to new art, experimental music, and creative fashion. This period of anti-conservatism moved away from traditional institutions and practices, further diminishing the class divide. The country also went through a period of reform which tackled issues such as abortion, divorce, sexual orientation, and racial discrimination, subjects that were taboo up until this point. Unfortunately, this period also saw one of the worst economic states the country has ever seen. Britain was spending too much money on its defences and imports and wasn't investing enough in industry, causing jobs to be lost and profits to fall. In the 1960s, the relationship between the Unionists and Republicans in Northern Ireland broke down. with conflicts breaking out between the two factions. The Unionists wanted to remain within the United Kingdom, while the Republicans fought for independence as they wanted a united Ireland. In 1969, Britain sent its army into Northern Ireland to quell the conflict, which was met with retaliation from the Irish Republican Army, who violently attacked soldiers. In 1972, 14 Irish Catholics were killed during a march, which became known as Bloody Sunday. This only heightened tensions, which led to Britain taking over the control of the Northern Ireland government. While this was only meant to be for a short period of time, it lasted for 35 years. Britain tried to share power between the two Irish factions, but the plan failed and violence broke out once again in 1974. The price of oil rose exponentially in the 1970s due to other countries taking control of their own industries, which severely affected the British economy. This crisis led to union strikes and the Conservative Party, led by Margaret Thatcher, coming into power. Britain's economy saw massive changes made based on monetarist theory. The government made many cuts to spending, which caused many jobs to be lost. This caused the 1981 riots that saw youth lash out about poor job prospects and the feeling of discrimination among the black community. In 1982, Argentina took over the Falkland Islands, which was a British territory at the time. Margaret Thatcher managed to defeat Argentina over control, which boosted her popularity in the country for a short period of time. By the middle of the 1980s, privatization was in full swing. This allowed more British people to invest in shares, which increased profits for the government. Around this time, in 1985, the Irish Republic accepted that Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, although conflicts within the country continued. With a new millennium being ushered in and the digital age taking root, the British Empire came to an end, with many of its territories now given independence. Britain entered into a union with Europe to bolster its economy and trade industry, but this split opinions. Eventually, it led to the 2016 Brexit referendum, where the majority of the British people chose to leave the Union. With the death of Queen Elizabeth II on September 8, 2022, after reigning for an incredible 70 years and 214 days, the United Kingdom moved into a brand new era under King Charles III. In 2023, the country now faces an energy crisis while continuing its efforts to deter conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Throughout its incredible history, the United Kingdom has made many integral contributions to the world, from industry to culture. Since World War II, Britain has made a huge impact on culture, literature, film, television, music and theatre, which continues to act as an inspiration for many nations. The most significant contribution, however, would be the English language itself, which has become a universal language around the globe, bringing many cultures, economies and nations together in a shared legacy of this small island with a vast and unforgettable history. From the first footprints on a forgotten coastline to the digital pulse of a modern global power, the story of the United Kingdom is a tapestry woven with threads of invasion and innovation, rebellion and royalty. It is a saga written in stone, steel and statute. The legacy of this small group of islands has irrevocably shaped our entire world. Its history is not just a record of the past, but a living story, and the next chapter is being written now. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the ages. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a like, comment and subscribe.